Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're going to break down how a single conflict didn't just kick off a war, it basically pulled back the curtain on who really calls the shots on the world stage.
Okay, so let's get right into it. This is a story about how one regional flare-up sent massive shockwaves across the entire globe. It forced some of the world's biggest powers to show their cards in a super high-stakes game of military and economic chicken. So, how did this whole thing even start? Well, it all kicked off on February 28th, 2026, with a single event that just blew past every red line and threw the Middle East headfirst into open war. I mean, within a matter of hours, a shadow war that had been simmering for decades just exploded into a direct, no-holds-barred confrontation. The initial strikes by the U.S. and Israel were absolutely devastating. They weren't just hitting military sites, they went right for the heart of the Iranian regime. And the response? Iran's IRGC unleashed a counterattack on a scale nobody had ever seen before. And the fallout from that first day? Well, it was immediate. It was violent, and it set the entire region on fire as Iran's retaliation got underway. Let's be clear, Iran's response was anything but symbolic. We're talking about a widespread, full-on attack. For the first time ever, missiles and drones rained down on every single country in the Gulf Cooperation Council. They hit U.S. bases, critical energy infrastructure, and even started targeting commercial ships. The war literally came crashing down into the region's most glamorous, glittering cities. It just completely shattered that illusion of safety. You know, for some of these Gulf states that had been trying really hard to lower tensions, this was a brutal reminder that, nope, you are not safe from this conflict. And then came this message. Talk about a power play. With this one broadcast, Iran moved to shut down one of the most critical oil choke points on the planet. They essentially put a chokehold on a huge chunk of the world's energy supply, and you better believe insurance costs for shipping just went through the roof. But once the initial shock wore off, this war turned into something else. It became this brutal, cold calculation, a war of attrition. It became all about the numbers. And that's the billion-dollar question, right? Who can actually afford to keep fighting? It's not just about who has the fanciest weapons anymore. It's about who runs out of missiles or who runs out of money first. Okay, you have to look at this because this right here is the crazy math at the heart of Iran's strategy. Think about it. A single wave of 100 cheap drones might cost them a couple of $1,000,000. But for the defenders, they're forced to fire off hundreds of millions of dollars worth of interceptors to stop them. It's a strategy literally designed to bleed your enemy dry financially. Now, we gotta put a big disclaimer here. These numbers are unverified, but they do seem to show a trend. Iran's first salvo was just massive, right? But it looks like the sheer cost, plus the relentless counterstrikes hitting their launch sites and warehouses, started to drain their arsenals pretty darn quick. And then you see this number, $5.5 billion. That's the estimated price tag for the U.S. in just the first 6 days. It just goes to show you, even for the biggest military in the world, the bill for modern war comes due, and it comes due fast. This thing became an economic slugfest just as much as a military one. But, maybe the biggest shockwaves of all were felt thousands of miles away in Beijing. For China, this conflict wasn't just a news story. It was a full-blown strategic crisis that laid bare the limits of its power. See, for President Xi Jinping, this was a direct hit to his game plan. For years, the situation was kind of perfect for them. Iran was a useful partner, right? They provided cheap oil, and just as importantly, they kept the United States bogged down and focused on the Middle East. This war threatened to just blow that whole convenient setup to pieces. The war really exposed some critical weaknesses in China's whole strategy. First off, any mess with oil from the Gulf is a direct hit to China's economy. Simple as that. Second, if Iran gets weaker, the U.S. suddenly has a lot more time and resources to focus on Asia, which is not what Beijing wants. And third, it looked bad. China looked like a giant on the sidelines, not a global power that could protect its partners. Now, from Beijing's point of view, was there any good news here? Well, there was one potential silver lining. The idea of another long, expensive American quagmire. If the U.S. got stuck in another endless conflict, hey, that would theoretically help China's long-term goals. But, and this is a huge but, the immediate problems were just way, way worse. We're talking about urgent economic crises, diplomatic nightmares, a massive headache right when they were trying to manage high-stakes talks with the U.S. And this really gets to the ugly truth that the war laid bare. For all its economic muscle, China is not yet a global security provider. It showed that when Washington decides to use force, Beijing can protest, it can condemn, but it can't actually stop it. So after all that, what's the big takeaway here? What does a conflict like this really tell us about the world we're living in right now? I think this quote from the Times of India just nails it. Lots of countries can build things, they can trade, they can grow their economies. But the raw ability to just break the global system, to completely rewrite the rules overnight, that power still rests in very, very few hands.
Ultimately, this whole conflict was just a brutal, real-world lesson in what analysts call hard power. It was a reminder that when push comes to shove, military and economic strength are still the final judges in what happens between nations.
And that kind of leaves us with the ultimate question, doesn't it? As the old rules get tested and broken, who actually has the power? Who has the resources? And, maybe most importantly, who has the will to write the next chapter? Thanks for digging into this with us.